Alright, we're back to Mr. Hayden Talks Over Music video for this week, and we will be listening to Beethoven's Third Symphony. Beethoven is probably the composer that we've talked about out of Debussy, Berlioz, and Mendelssohn that you just have the most innate awareness of. You've probably heard his name, and when someone's like, mention a classical composer, you probably think Beethoven. You probably think either Beethoven, Mozart, maybe Bach. One of those three is probably the ones that you think of. So just some background on who Beethoven is. Beethoven is a very important composer. Not only is he a good composer who is still very famous today, he's super important in terms of music history and music theory and music writing. He serves as this bridge between two different eras, sort of like how when we were talking about Prelude to an Afternoon of Buffon and Debussy, how his music was like the beginning of the modern era of music. Beethoven serves as a bridge between the classical era, which is, think Mozart, and then the Romantic era, and think Berlioz or Mendelssohn in that era. So he serves as that bridge. He was in both and was a driving force in both. Beethoven's career is divided up into three sections: early, middle, and late. Early is very much classical. It sounds like the music of his day. You listen to like Symphony No. 1, and you think this is a classical symphony. It's following the form of the symphonies of the day, and all his other works, they very much fit into their genres. They're pushing the genres, because that's what Beethoven did, but they still fit. It feels older. His middle period, which is started by this piece, is really where he starts pushing boundaries. He's trying to see what rules he actually has to follow. And then his later period, I believe it's Symphonies 7, 8, and 9, are very much Romantic era. He has gone further away from tonality. We talked about how Debussy would just kind of use whatever notes he wanted like to paint, essentially. Beethoven is sort of the start of that. Before Beethoven, they were much more fixated on, using the correct notes. Beethoven sort of pushed away from that. He's not crazy radical like Debussy was in terms of just doing whatever he wanted. He still was following rules. But he was also breaking just about as many rules as he was following. His probably the most famous work that you know from Beethoven is actually from this later period, but it's not necessarily typical of that era. It's Ode to Joy. Do 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 do. Right, you know what, we played it in class. And even if you didn't play in class because you were a packet person, you've definitely heard it. You probably heard us play it too. So let's narrow in a little bit. Let's start talking about specifically Symphony No. 3. So Symphony No. 3, as I mentioned earlier, is considered the start of his middle period. In terms of Beethoven's life, he now knows that he's going deaf. Like that beginning era, he either wasn't going deaf, didn't know he was going deaf, or just didn't really accept it. Before Symphony No. 3, he in fact almost killed himself because he thought, how could I be a composer while I'm going deaf? You can't be both. Obviously he was wrong because he's still the greatest composer, was totally deaf by the end of his career. So this symphony was written in 1803, and the first premiere was in 1804. And this first premiere was actually at just like some guy's house, a very rich person. He just hired the orchestra and had Beethoven perform for his party. So imagine like you got your favorite performer to come to just like some party you were having, for just you and your friends, and they performed one of their best, like their brand new album, which is one of their best albums. That's essentially what this would be like, just to kind of put that into terms. This person was a patron of Beethoven, so he paid Beethoven for him to work. Think of like classical composers essentially were doing Patreon before Patreon was a thing. That's sort of where the name Patreon comes from. It comes from patron. There's someone who would just give you money for you to work. That's how a lot of artists survived back then. And I guess survive now. and then it was another year later in 1805 when the symphony was publicly premiered. The initial reviews of the symphony were kind of split. Some people thought it was a masterpiece and genius, and others thought it was, let me read from the book, found it too long, difficult, and strange. You can't win them all, but obviously, nowadays we consider it to be a masterpiece and one of the greatest works of music ever written. There's a couple unusual features that I'm going to read from. I'm going to paraphrase from the book. So, it's called, the name of the symphony is Symphony Eroica, which means heroic symphony. And there's a whole lot of things going on with this name. So, as you probably heard, it sounds pretty kind of hero, kind of almost like a fanfare, like you think of like in a show, like the show, like a fanfare. That's because it's supposed to evoke a heroic figure. And originally this piece was dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was even called the Bonaparte Symphony. Now, for those of you who aren't quite sure who Napoleon Bonaparte is, I'll go into a little bit of history. So, you might remember from history class how there was the American Revolution. America was breaking away from England, and we had a war, but we desperately needed an ally in that war because we were just colonies fighting one of the strongest military powers in the world at the time. So we reached out to the long-running rival of England, France. And France decided to support us because they didn't want England to win. And there's a whole bunch of other geopolitical things going on, such as colonies and all that. But essentially, the French don't like the English, and the French were like, well, this is a way that we can screw over our English neighbors. So they decide to help us out. This means sending people to come train our troops, supporting us with money, the Navy, all the stuff. You might have talked a little bit about it in world history class. The problem with this was, well, we got our independence and had the whole revolution, wars are expensive. And it cost France a lot of money to be involved in this war, which led to France not having money. And the royalty didn't particularly care how the peasants were treated. So life was not happy and was not going well in France at the time. And then the people decided, we've had enough of this. Look at the fancy Americans. They just had a revolution. Let's have our own revolution. They overthrew the king, killed the king. If you've ever heard the phrase, let them eat cake, it comes from that revolution, in that Marie Antoinette, who is essentially the Queen of France, said, oh, well, the peasants don't have bread. Let them eat cake instead. That's not the exact quote, but that's just the famous quote. And so they go through that. There's a bunch of beheadings. If you know what a guillotine is, it comes from this. Lots of people get killed for not supporting the revolution or for whatever. And as the dust is sort of settling on the first revolution, that there's this general named Napoleon Bonaparte who comes up out of the ashes and ushers in a French empire. He takes control of the forces, seizes control of the country, essentially becomes a dictator, declares himself emperor. So they had replaced the king just to have an emperor. It's a whole long story, but Napoleon instituted a whole lot of good policies, or what some people would say are good choices. Public education, a whole bunch of other things, and so Beethoven was enamored with him for a while, but then Napoleon went and did a whole bunch of wars, and then all of Europe tried to stop him. It's very complicated, but Beethoven stopped liking Napoleon, or Napoleon Bonaparte. And then later, the dedication to the piece it just says, I'll read it once I find it. Heroic Symphony, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. It doesn't specify what great man it is specifically, It could be Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, but a lot of people think that it's actually Beethoven. Beethoven wrote this piece about himself, that the heroic person it's dedicated to is him continuing to be an artist and fighting against the struggles of going deaf. So Beethoven is very likely the actual heroic person in the symphony. Now, you probably heard the main theme of the piece earlier. Now, what I find is fascinating is that it almost tells a story like what we saw in Symphony Fantastique or Prelude to an Afternoon of Fun. That theme changes throughout the piece and become like it starts off heroic, goes through some struggles in the development section, and then comes back later and is strong and triumphant. This piece is in Sonato Allegro form, which we discussed a little bit, and I'll just recap what that is. So essentially we have our exposition, where we're introduced to our themes, in this case the heroic theme. Then we have our exposition, where we introduce new themes, we're in a different key, just what different things happen. Then we have our recapitulation. And then finally there's a coda at the end, which is just one more idea. The recapitulation, recap for short, is just allows that developmental material just done again. Another fascinating thing about the form of this piece is how it's distributed. So it's sort of interesting that the development section is longer than any of the other sections, almost combined but not quite. Let me find it in the book. Yes. So the development section, so that middle section where things change and the keys change and all that, is 244 measures. Whereas the exposition, so the opening of the piece where we're introduced to our themes, is only 153 measures. And the recapitulation, which restates the exposition, is 153 measures. And then the coda is 141 measures. And it's insane that the coda, which is supposed to just be like a little tag at the end, is almost the same as the exposition, right? And that, with the development being that long, that's also this just huge anomaly. It's really weird. You do not see that. Another thing that's interesting about this is the style. One, it's in 3/4, which isn't necessarily abnormal, but it is a bit weird to see a first movement of a symphony in 3/4 time. Now, to us, it sounds like a fanfare. It sounds like a heroic piece. But that is because we live after this piece came out. If we had been alive at the time and heard this originally, like when Beethoven was alive, we would have associated this style, this tempo, with a dance, like a country dance, which further goes into telling that story of like humble country origins and moving into a fanfare. And as you listen to the piece, it changes and gets more heroic. It goes from the country origins to something more heroic. The dance style is actually a predecessor to the waltz, and we've worked on waltzes in most, I think 7th grade. They're in 3/4 with a that first beat is a strong beat. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? This is also really, really pretty quick. Like you could almost imagine dancing to this beat. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's very, very fast. And apparently, Beethoven, like the tempo markings Beethoven wrote in his score, were actually significantly faster than what most people perform this piece now. So it was even faster. If you enjoyed listening to this piece, the piece should be about over. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoyed listening to the piece and listening to me ramble on and on and on about the Napoleon Bonaparte, about the history of the name, about who Beethoven is, why he's significant, all these different things. Make sure to complete the assignment on Google Classroom as per usual. I think you know what to do. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you in future videos, see your assignments.